I'm approaching close to 50 years old. However, it's fantastic. I'm working as a DJ utilizing their new software. Some of the best DJs are Chances with Wolves, a trio of lads. Andy Rourke is the quiet soul of one of the most important bands of all time, but his name is rarely featured on magazine covers. Rourke never required attention or accolades to establish his value as the bassist for the Smiths, the band that embodied the dark, rebellious, and razor-sharp attitude of Britain in the 1980s. Underneath Morrissey's sad lyrics, he allowed his instruments to speak for him. Johnny Marr's tangled guitar was wonderfully counterbalanced by melodic and sensitive bass lines that were sometimes as hushed as a sigh and other times as cunning and complex as a secret joke. However, how did a youngster who was raised alone in Manchester's dreary housing estates after his mother abandoned him end up becoming the emotional backdrop for the melancholy of an entire generation? How could a young man who had fallen into addiction and who had been famously fired by his fellow musicians by handwritten note get back up and continue to create until the end of his life? The tale of Andy Rourke is one of subdued passion. After losing a child, years of straying from the spotlight of celebrity, and a lonely cancer death while living in exile in New York, there were no lengthy memoirs or solo smashes. However, all it takes for the memories to return to the millions of people who love the Smiths is one bass line. And like a personal recollection, Andy Rourke's name reverberates with him. Never forgotten, but never loud. Perhaps it's time to reflect and consider what really drew someone to him. Childhood. Andy Rourke was born into a middle-class household in Manchester on January 17, 1964. Michael Rourke, his father, was an architect of Irish descent. Mary Stone, his mother, was of English descent. His parents used to be a creative and active couple. Building long-lasting structures was Michael's dream. Mary had studied fine painting, but the demands of everyday living overshadowed their aspirations. Their marriage was gradually shattered by financial strain, emotional detachment, and an increasing burden in the family. Mary moved to Mallorca, Spain, when Andy was barely 11 years old, with no apparent reason. It was more than just a domestic disturbance for the sensitive youngster she left behind. It was the first significant crack in a world that was already unstable. The only affection in a male-dominated household had come from Mary, who had taught him to draw and play jazz records in the kitchen every morning. The house felt drier, colder, and more tense when she went. Andy shared a home with his father and his older brothers, who were kind but emotionally aloof. He discovered how to control his sadness on his own by being silent. When it came to holding his son, Michael Rourke, a devoted but emotionally distant father, was at a loss. Rather, he gave what he could, never protesting when Andy smoked marijuana in private, not questioning him when he missed weeks of school, and discreetly purchasing musical instruments without ever asking his son what he planned to do with them. Music became Andy's lone haven in that setting. Nobody can recall exactly who gave him his first acoustic guitar when he was 7 years old. It may have been a hand-me-down from a distant uncle or a delayed birthday present from his mother before she vanished. In any case, Andy clung to music after that, as though the strings could somehow entice out what he was unable to say. Andy was a shy kid at St. Augustine's School who got into problems a lot and almost quit. He later met Johnny Marr, a classmate who was described as challenging yet full of passion and aspirations. As they traded cassette tapes, played guitar during lunch breaks, and dreamed of a musical future that extended well beyond the dreary streets around them, the two soon became inseparable. Andy Rourke's youth was characterized by the accumulation of peaceful days, the lack of traditional affection, and the way music filled that hole rather than any one dramatic occurrence. He was shaped by these factors. He never yearned for attention. He only ever required a small space and a bass guitar to use sound to communicate his story. Early career Andy Rourke had virtually abandoned formal schooling by the time he was 15 years old. He had little interest in a traditional future, consistently missed school, and had low grades. However, that wasn't all that unusual for Manchester teenagers in the early 1980s. This was what made Andy unique. He wasn't just floating around. He was certain of his desires. The bass was the first to play. Andy didn't think twice when Johnny Marr, his classmate, fellow marijuana user, and fellow fan of Motown and T-Rex, announced that he needed a bassist for his band. Even though Rourke had begun on guitar, he moved very naturally to bass, not because he was being demoted, but because he was aware of the background's beauty and the faint pulse that others frequently overlooked. For Andy, the bass carried the essence of the music and did more than simply keep time. Inspired by Chic and James Brown, they founded their first band, Freak Party, which had a funk and soul foundation. Freak Party tended towards something more American, whereas the majority of Manchester youths were embracing the raw fury of punk. More sophisticated, groovier, and possibly a bit too sophisticated for the local scene. Although the group was short-lived, it set important foundations. Johnny Marr knocked on Stephen Patrick Morrissey's door when he started to imagine a different kind of band, one that encapsulated the searing loneliness, fury, longing, and confusion of their time. The Smiths started to take shape after that. Despite not being in the original lineup, Andy Rourke was always there, waiting, practicing, and filling in. After auditioning several other bassists, Johnny Marr formally welcomed Andy onto the band in March 1983. They were aware that he was the only player who could play like him. His power-infused gentleness, his ability to blend in without being noticed, and his beautiful phrasing. The Smiths were still unsigned at the time, simply a young band performing in local clubs, but during those claustrophobic performances, the sound started to come together, and Rourke's bass lines swiftly established themselves as an essential component of the recipe. At the time, all Andy had was a bass guitar, a closest friend named Johnny Marr, and the conviction that music was the only route out of Manchester. No one, not even Andy, recognized they were standing on the precipice of something huge. By note after note, not by train or airplane. Professional achievement. The Smiths had a brief but explosive rise from 1983 to 1987. It lasted only 4 years, but it had a greater influence than bands that lasted for decades. Andy Rourke, the last member that gave the Smiths their distinctive sound, was the least featured, but possibly the most important member of that group. Sad but alluring, piercing but rife with internal strife. Andy Rourke subtly provided the framework for it all with bass lines that not only supported but also told their own tales, while Johnny Marr created complex guitar mazes and Morrissey destroyed eerie, frequently humorous lyrics. Listen to Rourke's bass slither like a sharpened sword as you listen to the seemingly straightforward tune this charming man, always changing with every chord cycle and never repeating. Alternatively, savagery starts at home, where the bass pretty much takes center stage, funky, bold, and virtually dancing over the rubble. Rourke was creating the framework of each song, not just playing notes. His bass lines combined elements of funk, classical music, and Motown to create a smooth yet complex sound. This backbone gave the Smiths music life, empathy, and a resonance that delved far into the listener's subconscious, enabling it to transcend the boundaries of post-punk or indie rock. But there was a shadow behind the light. Rourke struggled with heroin addiction during recording The Queen is Dead, which is today regarded as the band's masterpiece. When Morrissey gave him a short handwritten message, the tension reached its height, letting him know that he was no longer a Smiths member. It ended with a piece of paper, no discussion, no meeting, and no opportunity to clarify. However, Rourke and Johnny Marr's relationship turned out to be stronger. The companion who had once skipped school with Marr to play music was gone, but Marr couldn't accept it. He insisted that Andy come back, and Morrissey finally gave in. Ironically, Rourke finished recording the bass for the album, and his performance ended up being one of its most praised artistic elements. Rourke remained in music after the Smiths broke up in 1987, but he never achieved the same success again. In addition to becoming a sought-after session musician who worked with musicians like Sinead O'Connor, The Pretenders, and Badly Drawn Boy, he played bass on Morrissey's early solo singles. Rourke added a unique creative element to each recording, even if it was frequently done behind the scenes. He lived his life on his bass, even when not performing on a large stage. He later co-founded Freebase, an ambitious supergroup of Manchester-based superstars, alongside Peter Hook, New Order, and Manny, the Stone Roses. Despite its brief existence, it demonstrated Rourke's prominence in the music industry. Alongside Dolores O'Riordan, the Cranberries, and Blitz Vega, his last New York-based group, he also performed with DRK. Andy Rourke was one of the few people who could make the bass more than just a background instrument, although he was never the most well-known or financially successful. It developed into a voice, a warm, low, and sad voice that mirrored the silent burden he bore throughout his life. Personal life. Andy Rourke was a reserved performer who hardly spoke on stage and never sought attention. Behind the bass lines, however, was a life molded by quiet struggles with himself, his broken family history, and the very people he once referred to as his artistic brothers. Both the strain of success and the unresolved loneliness that had plagued him since boyhood contributed to Rourke's descent into heroin addiction in his 20s, during the height of the Smiths' fame. Rourke sought solace in drugs, but Morrissey maintained a solitary life and Marr directed his energies toward music. It affected not only his physical well-being but also his relationship with Morrissey, which was damaged and never entirely recovered. With just one handwritten message, Morrissey dismissed Rourke from the Smiths in late 1986. The Smiths are no longer with you. Goodbye and good luck. There was no discussion and no opportunity for justification. Rourke was financially and emotionally devastated by the hit, but instead of openly taking revenge, he said nothing. A few weeks later, he was subtly welcomed back after being pressed by Johnny Marr. The band never discussed what had transpired in public. Rourke remained strangely loyal to the people who had wronged him after the Smiths broke up. From Sweethead to the final of the well-known international Playboys, he continued to play bass on Morrissey's early solo tracks. He avoided getting involved in the increasingly acrimonious public arguments between Morrissey and drummer Mike Joyce, never addressed the media about the band's conflicts, and never made personal attacks. However, another fracture surfaced in 1996. Morrissey and Marr were sued by Rourke and Joyce for their Smiths Days uneven royalties. Joyce put up a strong fight and received a sizable payout. However, Rourke agreed to give up all future claims in exchange for a considerably lesser out-of-court settlement, reportedly for about £83,000. He merely said, "I was tired," in response to the question of why he settled early. "All I wanted was serenity." Rourke had no children and was never married. According to those close to him, he had experienced intense love on several occasions but always distanced himself when things got serious, seemingly not believing in long-term relationships. He relocated to New York in the late 2000s and led a modest existence in a modest apartment in the East Village, where he composed music, performed as a DJ, and worked on his last project, Blitz Vega. However, his connection with Johnny Marr remained constant. Despite leading different lives, the two maintained a close relationship, played together when they could, and became particularly close during Rourke's latter years. In the press, Marr frequently supported Rourke, describing him as the most kind person I've ever encountered. Marr also broke the news of Rourke's death. Andy Rourke's private life consisted of a series of silent sacrifices. He never demanded justice, never revealed others to take his place, and never used gimmicks or nostalgia to try to make a comeback. Even though his heart was exhausted, he continued to play and give it everything he had. And his dignity was ultimately defined by that. A modest, devoted, and indestructible artist who lived in the lower echelons of society. Influence and legacy. Andy Rourke never put out an album as a solo artist. He was never listed among the pioneering artists or stage legends in magazines. However, his name is somewhere else for the millions of Smiths followers and innumerable musicians that followed. In the way a background melody can make a song come to life, in every low, humming bass line, and in the silent acknowledgement that true musicians give to one another without shouting praise. Rourke changed the definition of an alternative band bassist. Rather than merely maintaining the beat or providing background noise, he gave the bass a unique, expressive, and soulful voice. This endearing chap appears in The Queen is Dead. Heaven is aware of my current misery. Home and dozens of other tapes are where barbarism starts. His playing was the lifeblood, not just the backbone. The emotional undertone that lies beneath Marr's intricacy and Morrissey's sarcasm. Rourke has been explicitly mentioned as an influence by numerous well-known bassists, including Alex James, Blur, Guy Berryman, Coldplay, Nick O'Malley, Arctic Monkeys, and Adam Devonshire, among others. Even bands that don't sound like the Smiths, like Interpol or the 1975, have something to do with his melodic construction. Silent, but distinct. Humble but unwaveringly self-assured. Even more remarkable is the fact that Rourke never pursued titles. He didn't write a memoir, whine about being ignored, or leverage his prior success to exaggerate his current status. He frequently avoided discussing the Smiths in infrequent interviews, and when asked, he would merely grin and respond, "I'm proud, but I've got other things to do." Fans and other musicians were shocked by his death in 2023 following a protracted, private struggle with pancreatic cancer. Johnny Marr described him as an irreplaceable partner, a lovely soul, and the melody within the tune. Morrissey, who is renowned for being cautious with his praise, remarked, "As long as his music is heard, he will never die. No statue, museum, or street bears Andy Rourke's name. No posthumous award, but one thing never goes away. Andy is there whenever someone's heart is stirred by the idea that there is a light that never goes out or that they are still ill. He doesn't have to return. He was never gone." Last years. Andy Rourke spent his last years in New York, a city that was alive with activity and noise, where he could blend in with the throng, while maintaining his personal privacy. He never really left music, but he stopped making frequent appearances in the media and at music festivals. He continued to write in his modest East Village apartment, work with pals, and DJ for a nearby radio station, curating sets of rare, subtle tunes that reflected his distinctive taste. Together with British artist Kev Sandhu, he co-founded Blitz Vega in 2018, marking a musical comeback with a fresh vibe and upbeat attitude. They recorded in Los Angeles, fusing contemporary pop and rock elements with upbeat, socially concerned lyrics. Rourke continued to create music as though existence only made sense when it was transformed into sound, even though he had nothing more to prove. However, Andy was engaged in a silent conflict even as he produced in silence. He barely told anyone outside of close friends and family that he had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in 2021. There were no interviews, no fundraising initiatives, and no sincere social media posts. He dealt with his sickness the same way he had always lived, quietly, bravely, and without seeking sympathy. His constant friend at the time was Johnny Marr, who would visit, check in, and offer support. In the last months of Rourke's life, they even recorded together, a tender conclusion to a creative and friendship relationship that started when they were just schoolboys. Andy Rourke died at Memorial Sloan Kettering Hospital in New York on May 19, 2023. He was 59. Johnny Marr made the announcement in a succinct, sincere statement that was filled with both sadness and appreciation. He was among my closest pals. For his role, he will always be remembered. And for his identity, there was no lavish memorial or funeral, but in the days that followed, musicians from Manchester to Brooklyn stopped on independent stages all over the world to pay tribute to the man who had never wished to be remembered yet was adored as though he had never left. There was not much fame in Andy Rourke's last years, but there was enough: peace, friendship, and music. And that was more than sufficient for someone like him. Andy Rourke was never a Grammy winner. Sobtales were not his style. He never penned a memoir on the Smiths' heyday. But for more than 40 years, he stayed silent, loyal, and creatively unrelenting, like a calm heartbeat in a chaotic musical universe. Andy Rourke never required center stage, from a youngster who was left by his mother and raised in a cold Manchester home to the guy who created a sound that characterized a whole generation. He made the decision to stand behind, where each bass line turned into a whisper for things that words could never adequately describe. While no one is immortal, some things never go out of style. To ensure that you don't miss any more articles like this one, please click like, subscribe, and turn on the bell if you think that artists like Andy Rourke should be recognized and remembered. Which Smiths song is your favorite? Sometimes we can keep someone around a little longer by using musical memory, so share it in the comments. I hope to see you again on The Real Adventures with the Genuine People.